Thank you for that. Alan Brown.
Thanks, Chair. Hi, Alec. Alec, you spoke about when you took over some unresolved disputes, and there's no formal mechanism really for resolving them. Obviously, the COSA chats weren't actually working. Am I right in thinking there was also an issue with budget underspends, that if the then Scottish Government, if they hadn't spent the full allocation of the budget, Westminster was effectively holding on to that, and that was another matter that had to get resolved?
And was resolved, Alan. It was a big problem for the then Labour Liberal administration, and that was resolved as part of an agreement with the Treasury that you could have more financial flexibility in terms of if there was an underspend, it could be carried over to the next year. So there was more flexibility. That was a negotiation that took place between the finance ministers and was successfully carried out. I would suspect that a reason, thinking back, that it hadn't been resolved previously is because there wasn't the formal mechanisms in place. I mean, one of the great gains of that period of resuming the GMCs and the formal meetings was the dispute resolution procedure. Because I think in total, checking back as I did last week, I think we had 5 issues which were to go to the dispute mechanism which was established in 2010. Only one of them went the full way. And it's really interesting that, because when it be the UK government or, for that matter, a devolved administration is putting forward how shall we describe it, an adventurous position, right? You won't go to the full way of a dispute mechanism because you'll end up getting your exam paper marked adversely. So it has a way of resolving itself. And the only one that actually did go all the way on my checking was indeed Rodney Morgan's favourite subject of the Olympic spending. I should say this is not the Olympic Games itself. This was the infrastructure about the Games, which by the rules of the Barnett formula should have been Barnetted. There should have been a coefficient. And Rodney Morgan, I think he'd left office by the time, was right. He didn't get, for the devolved administrations, as much as he'd hoped. But nonetheless, in the principle, he was correct. And it wasn't an insignificant sum. It was tens of millions for Scotland and probably about half that for Wales. So that went to a dispute. And I think the agreement to have flexibility in the finances also came about because of the meetings of the finance ministers and the agreement between the officials that was able to come about.
And you said for Olympics here that was like tens of millions of pounds in Barnet. Do you remember how much the finance agreement in terms of underspend, how much money that freed up?
Oh, very substantial, much more than that. I mean, you would potentially, without that flexibility, I mean, I'm sure that a great deal was made of it politically. I probably made a great deal of it politically. But, it's not that difficult to, in a budget of then, what would it be, 40, 50 billion, to undershoot by high hundreds of millions. So that's not, it's also quite possible to go the other way. So the flexibility is the important thing. But it would be a matter of billions that was worth over a period of time to Scotland not to have the undershoot docked from the Scottish Government finances. Incidentally, since you're on finance, Alan, I think a very serious thing has occurred since that period we're talking about, since 2014, and this is the new financial structures which have evolved since the Smith Commission report, which I think are vastly detrimental to the devolved administrations. Basically because the Barnett formula, it's a bit like Palmerston on the Schleswig-Holstein question. Only 3 people understood it. One's mad, one's dead, and I've forgotten. Well, actually, I haven't forgotten. I understand the Barnett formula. I had reason to understand it for many reasons. Now, what's happened is Barnett's been qualified by a growth reward system. And because devolved administrations are unlikely to be growing as fast as the southeast of England, and because their growth potential is determined by UK fiscal policy, and in the case of Scotland, the performance of the energy industry, if there's a penalty for low growth, as there is within the formula now, then that can be severely detrimental to Scottish finances. It's an adjustment to the Barnett formula, which is a huge impost in Scotland at the present moment. And how it was, you could only have ever agreed this, either from a position of great political weakness or total innumeracy, or both. And the fact that that has now been subject to a review and agreed again, I find totally bewildering, and it would certainly not have been agreed in the period you're talking about when we were actually negotiating flexibility in Scotland's finances.
In terms of intergovernment relations or planning, if we go back to Barnett Forum, certainly Barnett Forum as was, obviously a lot of the money that gets released through the Barnett Forum is because UK government decides a need in England and where they're going to spend money in England, then Scotland gets a pro rata share, or if it's a budget overspend, Scotland might eventually get a pro rata share. And therefore at a budget, Scotland's meant to be grateful for the Barnett. But is that not an impossible way to actually plan long-term finances as well?
It's difficult. I mean, there are certain advantages to it, but not the advantages that you would have in terms of flexibility and overall command of your budget and fiscal policy. Remember, the Barnett is about the increase or decrease in spending. It's a pro rata, as you put it, an adjusted population share of the increase, not the whole, but of the increase or decrease. But whatever you might think the limitations of Barnett, which are quite right, are no substitute for what you might have elsewhere. The fact that it's been adjusted in this terms of growth imposition. I mean, what's happening if your economy is growing more slowly, as it has been recently, in terms of the UK, which is affected very much by the South East of England growth? It's a double penalty. You think if things weren't going as well as they should, you would get a bonus to say, right, this will help you, pull things up. Actually, what happens is a double penalty at the present moment. And, I always saw a calculation, which I've no reason to doubt, it's not my calculation, that of the sort of £1 billion of additional spending that the Scottish Government has raised from increased taxation, about 90% of it has been swallowed up by deductions through the growth formula that's been put into Barnett. Just think of that. I mean, it's a huge difficulty, and I've no idea why if that had been proposed to me back then, it would have been in the disputes procedure forever and a day, I can tell you.
Can I take you back to devolution, the concept of making devolution work? Because yesterday we had a lot of evidence, and the kind of view from those given evidence yesterday from Scottish Secretary of State positions was that now relationships are broken down because basically the SNP as a government don't want devolution to work. Now you've actually already set your stall out that you wanted devolution to work as part of that pathway to independence and actually having positive government structures. But I'll take you back to, I don't know if you remember this, this is an interview Lord Fowkes gave February 2008. Obviously now Baron Fowkes of Cumnock, who was very interested in yesterday's proceedings, and he said the SNP are in a very dangerous tack. What they're doing is trying to build up a situation in Scotland where the services are manifestly better than south of the border in a number of areas. The interviewer, Colin Mackay, then asked, is that a bad thing? And Lord George Fowkes says, no, but they're doing it deliberately. So is that very much an attitude, let's make it work, but let's actually improve services?
Yes, it was, and I think I probably reminded Baron Fowkes of it a number of times, because he was in the Scottish Parliament, of course, for 4 years, between 2007, unexpectedly, I think. I don't think he expected to be there. He was on the list in the Lothians for the Labour Party, but I probably reminded him of it quite a few times. But yeah, I mean, my idea was that one of the key, not the only, but one of the key components of building the case for independence was to govern the country competently. On the basis that people thought you could run the shop, then they would have more confidence in running the areas that the devolved Parliament wasn't in charge of. So to build confidence, and that meant running things productively and progressively. Why have they broken down recently? Well, again, I pointed, they're not broken down recently because there's been a defined referendum date or process to independence. They're broken down perhaps because there hasn't been. Because many subjects perhaps are used as arm wrestling bouts as a proxy for the constitutional argument. Now, there have been key difficulties in that period, remember. I mean, obviously Brexit, obviously COVID, which perhaps have put additional strains on the intergovernmental relations. But I can't help feeling that in the absence of a defined process, and lots of arguments, which otherwise would have just been settled or agreed, become somehow proxies for an overall constitutional battle. So perhaps the best idea would be to have a defined process, like in Northern Ireland, for example.
Could I just take back to intergovernment relations at an official level? So you already said your Permanent Secretary, Sir John Elbridge, had some frustrations. So what was the working relationship like between the officials, and did it improve during that period?
Yes, I mean, rather than me cite Sir John, if the committee goes back to his evidence, because he gave evidence with me 10 years ago, and you can see exactly what he said and how he couched it in civil service language. Sir John was a very powerful Permanent Secretary, as was his successor, Peter Housden. And they regarded what they were seeking for the Scottish administration was parity of esteem. They wanted, not pretending to be an independent government, but they wanted parity of esteem for a government. They wanted intra-governmental relations to be carried forward on that basis. And therefore they've devoted themselves to ensuring the prestige of their departments and carried themselves as Permanent Secretary in that manner. I'm not at all certain their successor did that. If you treat yourself as another UK government department, then you shouldn't be surprised if other UK government departments start seeing you in that way. And Sir John Elbridge, Sir Peter Housden, would not have seen their job every Wednesday to be at interdepartmental meetings down here, as their successor did. They regarded their job as making sure the Scottish government was running effectively, properly, and had parity of esteem with negotiations. They didn't regard the Scottish government as another UK Whitehall department.
And yet you'll be aware, despite that, you'll be aware that at the moment there are some accusations that the civil servants working for the Scottish government aren't impartial anymore, and Richard Hardy, National Secretary for Scotland, Northern Ireland, the Prospect, Dave Penman, General Secretary of FDA, have actually both expressed concern about the impartiality of civil servants in Scotland being questioned. Now, obviously, you managed the build-up to the referendum. There's a government white paper. Was there any difficulties in terms of, again, officials that are working for the Scottish government are elected by the Scottish electorate, so therefore the Scottish government responding to the wishes of the electorate effectively? Was there any issues of that accusation of impartiality or politicisation of the civil service back then?
Well, there was certainly controversy. I mean, some people, Baron Fultz, for example, found it difficult to adjust to the idea that a civil service working for a government who'd been elected on a mandate to seek Scottish independence should work as the government wished to try and formulate the independence plan. I mean, as I remember it, he can still speak for himself. Summon him before your committee. But Baron Fultz wasn't fully adjusted to that idea. But most people, and certainly the key people involved, which is Sir John Elbridge, I mean, he made that clear from day one, that the government had been elected, therefore it was the duty of the civil service to affect that government's policy as best he could. And of course that's the way it has to be.
Did other UK civil servants reporting to the UK government respect that as well?
Well, they were obviously working to a different agenda. I mean that's where it comes to the parity of esteem and mutual respect comes in. I mean, people can have disagreements in a negotiation as long as everybody knows which side they're on in the negotiation. Then you come to an agreement and you move on. I mean, I think it's true, as you'll see from Sir John Elbridge's evidence, they much preferred the dispute, if there was a dispute, or the argument to be between the ministers, and then once there was the agreement, they could go off and implement it. And they were absolutely delighted, obviously, with the Edinburgh Agreement, because it cleared the way for what exactly was happening, and they could go on with the independence white paper, the agreement of mutual respect and all the rest of it. And once the ministers had come to the decision, the civil service on both sides of the border were very good. My own impression of the UK civil service in terms of the problems is forgetfulness. I think some departments forget then about Scottish implications for what they're doing. rather than, there was, at that stage, some great conspiracy in Whitehall departments to do Scotland down or do Wales down or do Northern Ireland down. They just forgot it was there, And again, the ministerial meetings help. But remember, when you have a ministerial meeting, right, it means that department is not consumed by the Joint Ministerial Council, but, the Cabinet Office, if there was a plenary meeting of the JMC, that would be a major event that was coming up that the Cabinet Office had to plan for to make sure it was carried forward properly, look at all the implications, prepare the briefing papers. Nobody in the Cabinet Office would forget there was devolved implications when they were organising a GMC plenary meeting, and similarly with the other departments. So, in a way, the GMC's resumption was important to stop the absent-mindedness of Whitehall departments, in my opinion.
Just to remind colleagues, we'll try and finish this session about 12:30. There's 3 members indicated that still like to ask questions, and I know Alan Brown and Christine Jarden have already asked David Dukett's to come in, so if people just be generous with their time, we'll make sure everybody gets in and we'll let Mr Salmond away in good time. Now, Alan Brown.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Alec, you mentioned a few times about the Scotland office. You referred to the Lib Dem position. Indeed, Alistair Carmichael once called it the most pointless department in Whitehall. So that was before the Lib Dems went into coalition and he saw the light of a ministerial car. Obviously, that crossover year period when you were First Minister, so was there any government-to-government discussions then about the merits of the Scotland office and whether it should be abolished and what a better system could have been for that in intergovernment relations?
Well, as you probably saw, it was one of my bits of evidence to this committee 10 years ago. And of course, it was helped by the fact that Alistair Carmichael was sitting there. If I remember right, one of the committee members objected to my saying that members of the committee held this view because they only realised thought you, Chair, were the only person that held that view, because I'd known Alistair for a number of years on this matter. So at that time there was 2 members of the committee held that view. I suspect there's probably more than that today. I think, for all the reasons that have been stated, it would be simpler and more effective to abolish the Scotland office and to have, if Westminster, through the Cabinet Office, where I think would be the appropriate place, which gives you, of course, access up the chain to the Prime Minister, to have a Secretary of State for the nations, or however it wants to be described. I mean, the description is not as important as the idea. And basically making sure that the administrative framework, whether it's this new framework of cooperation or whatever, is carried forward properly. Because the trouble is we're having territorial individual secretaries of state, and probably the exception has been Northern Ireland, where the job should have been and is to facilitate the resumption of the devolved authority. But now it's back. They become attempted competitors to the established processes in Scotland. And that's not. It doesn't make for good governance. It doesn't make for efficient carrying out of affairs. And negotiations that Scotland should have, and Wales should have, and Northern Ireland should have with the Treasury in terms of finance, for a committee structure to coordinate good governance, and with the leaders of the free nations plus the Prime Minister in terms of coming to key decisions, and other ministers. That would be a much more effective thing, because otherwise you get into situations of unnecessary. Now, I never found that particular problem, it should be said, and I should say that some of the Secretaries of State in my term were, Mr Moore, for example, was very amenable. But that it's more the waste of it. And if, for example, the Secretary of State wants to take charge of development spending in Scotland or whatever, then that is a big intrusion into what traditionally, what should be regarded as part of the key responsibilities of the Scots Parliament. And the same would be the case in Wales. And I'm trying to remember, I think all the First Ministers I met from Wales agreed with that position.
And far from being abolished, the Scotland office actually seems more entrenched now in terms of there's 50% more staff now than there was in 2007. the staff cost budget's actually up tenfold. So is there any likelihood of it being abolished or this kind of government change to have, like a Minister of Constitutional Affairs? And is there any reason you can imagine why there's such a disparity now in the number of staff employed in the Scotland Office and staff costs?
Well, the likelihood may be less, but the incentive for doing it is surely greater, since there's much more money to be redirected to more useful purposes, I would have thought. So, I mean, I think they're wrong, incidentally. I mean, I think they would probably, from a Whitehall point of view, they probably would get better coordination through the Cabinet Office and through a Minister for the Nations. I mean, they seem to have both at the present moment. Both are Secretary of State for Scotland, Secretary of State for Wales, Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and they've got Michael Gove as well, as I understand it. I mean, I don't know if I'm misreading things, but he has a ministerial responsibility for intergovernmental relations. So I'm trying to work all this out. I mean, it's I'm not certain having Michael, whose talents everybody is well aware of, is probably the most the person who will engender the most peaceable cooperation between the various nations of these islands. Of course, the great thing about being a successful Machiavelli is nobody to realise you're a Machiavelli. I'm not sure that Michael Velli has achieved that.